Superstar. Superstar.
Is it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
So, we are talking Salem's Lot. I'll be talking a bit about the book, the 1979 miniseries, the 2004 miniseries, and we'll see what's going on with the proposed 2023 theatrical adaptation. So, the book was published in 1975. It was Stephen King's second novel following Carrie, which was a breakout hit. It was very well received, but Stephen King, his name and his fame kind of owe to the Brian De Palma's film adaptation of Carrie. That's when he really, really exploded onto the scene. And Salem's Lot is the beginning of. You see the trappings in Salem's Lot that King would carry on with in other stories later, like It and many other novels where the town itself is as much of a character as the characters within the novel. So some of the backstory of the book itself, Stephen and his wife Tabitha were just talking, and he said, "Oh, what would it be like if Dracula was in the 20th century?" And she said, "Oh, he'd probably get hit by a yellow cab on Fifth Avenue." So, couldn't really set a sort of modern day vampire story or a Dracula type story in a big city. So Stephen King went to his main roots and created the town of Jerusalem's Lot, shortened to Salem's Lot. And I love that the town is named for a hog named Jerusalem that went feral. Like, that is so, like, that's such a great small town little detail. And it's something I am a huge horror buff, but I also am a big fan of the show Gilmore Girls. And that feels like a detail that would be in a show like Gilmore Girls or something set in this sort of idyllic little small town. Like, yeah, the town's named after a pig. Turn left at the sign for that has the rooster statue. It gives off that vibe, which I love. And that is something in the book that is what is one of the things that it's really, really known for, that the town of Salem's Lot itself is really the main character of the story, along with the Marston house, where the vampire Barlow and his human familiar Straker, where they buy the house and basically operate out of it. The small town aspect that Stephen King would later perfect in other tales is so vital to the storytelling of Salem's Lot, because you could not have this story really any other way. You have so many different characters. You have this entire cast of these townies and all their little secrets. And that is they are as much of both the victims and villains of the story as much as the vampire Barlow and gradually as the townspeople are being turned are. Stephen King paints this picture of a place that on the outset, on the surface, seems like a perfectly nice town and these are perfectly nice people. But then it's revealed that people are having affairs, people are beating their babies. There's drunkenness, there's infidelity, there's all of these secrets. And the vampire is able to exploit all of these vulnerabilities and inner darknesses and use it as a foothold to gain leverage and eventually take over the town and the people completely, which I find that aspect fascinating. Now, in the novel, what's it being Stephen King's second book, you see him growing as a writer, but you still see where, especially if you read more of his later works, that he grows quite a lot. As well developed as the town itself is, a lot of the characters are overall very two-dimensional. The heroes are, in some ways, they're kind of a misfit band, which I will get into that in a little bit. But the good guys are mostly very good. The not so great people are mostly just that, not so great. Barlow, and then when the townsfolk are gradually becoming vampires, it's almost more like they are animals. This version of vampires are very animalistic. And there are different levels of vampire. Barlow is a type 1 who is incredibly powerful, and he is also very sophisticated and intelligent and worldly. Then the type 2 vampires who are able to turn other people, it almost feels like Jurassic Park, like they are the velociraptors, like they are very scary and very menacing, but they're not, once they become vampires, they are not really characters so much anymore. And the type 1, type 2, and then there's even type 3, that is something that the Dark Tower explores a lot more. Getting around to the Dark Tower in a little bit with one of the major characters in the book. And so we have our protagonist, Ben Mears, who is returning to Salem's Lot after 25 years. He's a semi-successful writer. Wow, Stephen King's protagonist is a writer? That's never going to come up again. But he comes back because he has a memory from his childhood of going into the Marston home on a dare. And the former owner of the Marston, Hubie Marston, was a very, very bad guy. He was a killer, and he killed his wife and then killed himself in the house. And as a child, Ben went into the house and saw the ghost of Hubie Marston's corpse hanging. And I love where Stephen King got that from, which was a very vivid dream he himself had when he was very young, where it was basically a haunted house, and he walked in and saw a hanging corpse. But the corpse, even with its eyes pecked out and deteriorating and decomposing, was obviously himself. And he wrote that into the book all those years later. And Ben, next to Ben, we have the love interest, Susan Norton. Honestly, guys, she's probably one of my least favorite female characters that Stephen King has written. And after coming from Carrie, which, Carrie is so dynamic and well-developed, Susan Norton is simple. She's pretty. She's sweet enough. She's attracted to Ben largely because he is an outsider. He's kind of glamorous. He represents a life that she wants outside of Salem's Lot, a big city kind of guy. And that's all fine and good, but she is, just as a character, she's just very stale to me. Stephen King would go on to write women far better in later novels. I wish I really had more to say about Susan, but there really isn't there really isn't a lot there, to be honest. And then in our cast of characters, probably the most important outside of Ben Mears himself is Mark Petrie, who Ben refers to as a vampire scholar. Young Mark Petrie loves everything horror. He loves, especially the Universal movie monsters. He's, like Ben, new to the town, and also like Ben, he's viewed by the community as strange. He's bullied and beaten up by other kids at school, and he responds in kind by actually beating up the bully because that is the only language they know. But it's the aspect of otherness is really interesting in Salem's Lot because of how much otherness was featured in Dracula, which obviously Salem's Lot is very, very heavily inspired by and a bit of a love letter to. Now, the otherness in Dracula concerning Count Dracula himself, there's a lot of xenophobia written into that character and why Dracula is so frightening. He's a foreigner. He does not belong. He represents things outside of London that alone is scary. It's not just the vampirism. He is an outsider. He's an other. And in Salem's Lot, both the villains and the heroes are all others in their own ways. You've got Ben Mears, who, in addition to coming back to Salem's Lot after 25 years and living what the town would consider a sort of glamorous lifestyle as a successful novelist, he is not the same stock as the rest of the town, especially the men. He's more of an artist. He is not a blue-collar, typical masculine guy. Mark Petrie, he's not like all the other kids. He loves movie monsters. He has toys and figures, and other boys in the town, namely Danny and Ralphie Glick, are excited to go over to his house and see his collection and view his strangeness. We've got Father Callahan, an alcoholic priest, and Matt Burke, the English teacher who is incredibly intellectual, and the doctor, whose name I'm forgetting right now, who, again, he's a man of science, and again, he's not the stereotypical masculine kind of guy that the rest of the men in the town largely are. And then you have the vampire himself, Barlow, and his human familiar, Straker. When the Marston house is purchased, everything is done through Straker. And the town doesn't know what's going on. There are these two foreign, older, sophisticated, worldly men moving into the town. What are they? Who are they? What are they about? And King posits that essentially being an other can either be evil or be the saviors, or at least the survivors. Now, I was listening to the Kingcast recently, and one of their episodes on Salem's Lot they did with the television writer and producer Brian Fuller, and he's done so much. His work is incredible. He did Pushing Daisies and Hannibal, American Gods. He's great. But one of his points about Salem's Lot, and a lot of Stephen King's work in general, reading it and experiencing it as a gay man, was the sort of queer coding of a lot of these characters and in the storytelling. And he himself says that was not Stephen King's intent. And you can read any piece in a certain, like through a certain lens. And reading through his experience, seeing how especially the town is maybe questioning Straker and Barlow, like are they gay maybe? And the bullies at school use a lot of gay slurs towards Mark Petrie. And even with characters, especially like Ben, who is more of an artist type, granted, remember this book was written in 75, so ideas and things were a bit different, but it is interesting to view the book through that lens and how Stephen King, both with his villains and protagonists, and sometimes there's a crossover, are typically othered from society in some way, shape, or form. And that really gives a lot of people, for however you feel apart from others, a way into these works and a way to relate and find common ground and insert yourself into the piece. And I think that that's absolutely wonderful. Now, as vampire stories go, Salem's Lot is okay. I mean, guys, it's no Twilight. Am I right? I am just hearing the collective clicking of the unsubscribe button. This is the skin of a disgraced YouTuber. I swear this is not going to be a Twilight episode. Although I could. It's so fun. Anyway. So vampires, that's a thing. So Salem's Lot is known to be a vampire book, obviously. But kind of how Cujo, when people think of it, they think of this rabid dog, when it really was an exploration of so many other things. It's similar with Salem's Lot. You really don't know until you're about halfway, even more halfway through the book, that vampires are going to be a thing. I mean, obviously we know at this point, but if you'd never heard of it and were reading it for the first time, it's only slightly hinted at, and it's not made apparent until you're well into the story. And King himself has said that Salem's Lot is Dracula meets Peyton Place, which is where that small town community and all the small town vices really, really play out. Now, I wish that either of the miniseries adaptations had been able to show that community aspect as well as it's fleshed out in the novel. Not that that makes it not a good adaptation. It loses a lot of that meat. It's harder to take a bite out of the community in the television adaptations. But the 79 adaptation, directed by legendary Tobe Hooper, if you're unfamiliar, he directed the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He also directed Poltergeist. He's absolutely incredible. And I think in almost anyone else's hands, the 79 miniseries probably would have or could have tanked. But he makes it work really, really well. Knowing that it was going to be for television, he focuses on the atmospheric side of it. He knows that it can't be too bloody. He doesn't have as much freedom as you would with a film. And that is what makes the 79 miniseries so enduringly creepy and memorable, is how just atmospheric it is. And some of the tricks he used is just absolute brilliance. Now, the vampire effects, especially the floating effects. There is the iconic scene of Ralphie Glick tapping at Mark Petrie's window asking to be invited in. And the way that they achieved it was, well, first of all, Tobe Hooper did not want to use wires. And because he said that you could always still see them on film and it just wouldn't do right. So they used a boom mic crane to lift the actors in any of the floating sequences. And then it was shot in reverse to make it look even more dreamlike and unnerving. And the effect is absolutely brilliant. Now, one of the things that the 79 miniseries differs from the novel is the character of Barlow himself. In the book, Barlow is very much a part of the entire story, and he is very worldly. He has a sort of a suaveness to his menace. They went an entirely different route with the Barlow of the screen. They chose to do a more Nosferatu looking vampire. He doesn't have any lines, and I think he is only on screen for a minute, maybe, like cumulatively, but he looks fantastic, and the vampire effects look wonderful. But oh my gosh, it seems hellish. The contacts they used were very, very trying. They could only be worn for 15 minutes at a time, and then the actors would have to let their eyes rest for an hour. The fangs and the long fingernails would keep falling off as shooting went on. So there was a limited time that these effects would be able to be utilized on screen. But the fact that they work so well and Tobe Hooper was able to work around those special effect issues is such a testament to why the movie works just so greatly. And I'll be honest, I watched the 2004 miniseries version when it came out, and I haven't revisited it since. So my memories of it are a bit lacking. I'll be upfront there. But what I do remember, well, it stars Rob Lowe as Ben Mears, and I remember being really excited because Samantha Mathis plays Susan, and I had recently got into the book Miss of Avalon, and she played Guinevere in the TV miniseries adaptation of that book, so I was really excited to see her. Now, the 79 miniseries cuts a major King character, that being Father Callahan, and he is brought back into the 2004 version and played by James Cromwell. If you got James Cromwell, oh my God, you gotta use him. So it's really nice to see him in that role, although they take him in a strange direction. But I'll come back to Father Callahan in just a little wee bit. And the 2004 miniseries comes back to form with the character of Barlow, in this played by the legendary Rutger Hauer. And Rob Lowe has a really funny story in an interview he did that apparently during one of the climactic scenes where Barlow has basically a 2-page villain monologue, Rutger Hauer did not bother to read the script or memorize his lines, and he just ad-libbed for a while, and there was something about him comparing vampires to cowboys. The director did not like that, and so they went to them having his lines on cue cards next to the camera. And I would really love to see that version of that scene. Like, just Rutger Hauer ad-libbing, like this kind of, like a bizarro version of the Tears in the Rain speech at the end of Blade Runner. I would love to see it so much. in an alternate universe, that's what they used, and I kind of want to live in that world for a couple of days. And then, along with Rutger Hauer, you have Donald Sutherland as Straker, and you really have some top-notch talent in the 2004 miniseries that is not wasted whatsoever. I do remember that being absolutely great. A lot of the other elements of it doesn't have that atmospheric quality that Tobe Hooper brought to the 79 miniseries. And I think partly is because it is transported into modern times. So the 2004 version takes place in the 2000s rather than in the 70s. And while you still have the isolation of it being in the small town and small town minds run amok and how the vampires are able to overtake the town with it being not a big city and being very insular, there is an aspect of it that is lost by bringing it to modern times. There are some works that have an isolated community that are taken over by vampires that, in a modern setting, work a little bit better. Is that something maybe we'll be discussing soon on the channel? I don't know. We'll see. Hint, hint, maybe. But moving on, we have to talk about Father Callahan. And Father Callahan, he at first comes off as kind of a stereotypical character. He is an Irish alcoholic priest. And he spends a lot of the novel just kind of moaning a lot. And he's not really the most pleasant character, to be honest. And his faith wavers when push comes to shove. The aspect of faith and spirituality is something that King comes back to in so many of his works. King is obviously, if you've read any number of his books or seen any film or TV adaptations of his books, you know that he is not a fan of organized religion, particularly Catholicism. But he is spiritual. And there is the good versus evil, white versus dark, that is very present in so much of his work. And you really see the beginnings of that in Salem's Lot. Superstition, it ain't the way. But superstition is the downfall of many characters in the story Salem's Lot. And that is a big thing with Father Callahan. He is facing off with Barlow, and he cannot toss aside his crucifix and really put his faith in it. And as his faith wavers, so does the power that the symbol of the cross has over Barlow. And Barlow's disappointed because he thought that Callahan might actually be a worthy foe. And when his faith disappears, he calls him a false priest. And the boy is 10 of you. Mark Petrie is able to deflect the vampires using a little toy of a cross that he plucks from one of his cemetery model that he has. And at one point, I forget if it's either Ben or if it's Mark, but they make a cross out of popsicle sticks. And their belief in that as a symbol, as a rejection of the vampires, is enough to actually send the vampires away. But when Father Callahan's faith in that symbol in what it means fades, so too does his faith itself. And rather than turn him into a vampire or kill him, Barlow forces him to drink his blood, thus making him unclean. Callahan isn't able to enter his church. He leaves the town disgraced. And I am very happy that this character was brought back into the King universe in the Dark Tower. He reappears in Wolves of the Kala, and then is in Song of Susanna, and then Dark Tower, the final book. Yes, and it still explores his struggle with his faith and his confidence, but I'm so glad to see that this character is fleshed out and he gets a redemption arc and he gets to become a hero. And in this world, he was disgraced and unclean. But then he is able to find faith and really find himself again through the quartet, through Roland and Jake and why can I think of the other members of the Dark Tower? It's been a long week, guys. It's going to be 12 degrees tomorrow, and I think everything in my brain is just frozen in anticipation of that. But the aspect of faith is something that King focuses on a lot throughout many, many of his stories, and it's really fun to see that kind of start to spawn in Salem's Lot. And then there are other stories very much inspired by Stephen King that take the elements of Salem's Lot, both with faith and the small town isolation and the inner workings and evils that are hidden underneath that congenial surface of small town life, and really explore it in a way that is just wonderful to see and could not happen without Stephen King's influence. And maybe there is a specific television show where the town itself, where it's located, is named for a character in Salem's Lot, that being Larry Crockett, who does the dealing with Straker to sell them the Marston home. And I don't know, maybe that's something we'll get into soon.
Yeah, midnight mass.
It's midnight mass. Yes. In case you can't tell, I'm so excited to be talking about midnight mass very, very shortly. But going back to Salem's Lot, where it all started. Oh, one thing I also wanted to mention that I didn't in talking about the book to begin with. Yes, obviously, the book is very much inspired by Dracula and then Peyton Place. But the Marston house itself is is a love letter to Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House. And he almost directly quotes it, I think, in the opening paragraph of the book. And so much like the town itself being its own character, the Marston house really is its character in its own right. It is where evils have happened in the past, and those evils bleed into the present day. And that is what the vampire is attracted to, and that is why he decides to make that his residence and his home base of operations. So just wanted to throw that in there because if I have an excuse to talk about Shirley Jackson and Hill House, especially, I'm gonna do it. So, 1979 miniseries, Tobe Hooper directing. 2004 miniseries starring Rob Lowe, before the real Rob Lowe renaissance that I think Parks and Rec really made happen. So there is supposed to be a theatrical version. Now, word of it started around, I think, 2019, 2020, and I believe that's when work started to be done. But a certain global bad thing happened in 2020 that's still kind of ongoing. That pushed things back. But the film adaptation, which will be directed by, or is directed by, I have the name. It's Gary Dauberman, who he is known for his work in the Conjuring universe. I believe he directed The Nun and one of the Annabelle movies. And I believe he wrote the screenplay for It Chapter 2. But he is directing, and it was supposed to come out in 2022. I've been looking for more info. There actually really isn't a lot of information about this upcoming theatrical version of Salem's Lot. From what I've read, it may be finally released in April of this year, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it's handled. Any theatrical adaptation of a long book, especially Stephen King, and especially this one in particular, where you do have such a large cast of characters and there's so much to delve into, shortening that and condensing it into a, say, 2-hour runtime, 2.5 hours if they're being really generous, is a difficult prospect. And both the miniseries were upwards of 4 hours long. So I'm very curious to see how that is handled. According to the director, it will be very faithful to the book. And, I'm cautiously optimistic, or at least curious. I'm honestly a little bit surprised that they're not doing it as a two-parter as they did with It and It Chapter 2. Because that seems, they're like, okay, more money, but it doesn't have a lot of, it doesn't have the aspects of the It movies that would draw in an audience for two separate films, namely that being a lot of the very familiar cast. And okay, we got a kid, one of the Stranger Things kids, and then we've got Bill Hader in the second one. Not that the cast there aren't big names, it just I guess it just doesn't seem like it's rife for indulging in a two-parter format. So we will see how that is whenever it's released, and I hope to see it in theaters, because even if a horror movie is bad, seeing a horror movie in theaters is so much fun. Sometimes it's almost better if it's bad, or at least if it's entertaining. But I hope to see it in theaters when it comes out, and so I can talk about it with you all on this show. So that's where I am going to leave you for the evening. I hope you enjoyed this very ping-pongy discussion of Stephen King, Salem's Lot, and all the vampire stuff, which is great. Anyways, my darling friends, I'm Aleece. This is the Late Late Horror Show, and as always, stay spooky.